Michael Gould, wartime baby. Tell me about what you remember in London back in those dark days of the Second World War. Can you remember anything?
My first sort of memory is that my father had received an Anderson shelter from the government, and he put it up in the alcove next to the fireplace in our sitting room. And although I'm not sure if I remember this, I seem to recall being in under that Anderson shelter bit, which was that sort of shape. And we had a bomb land in our back garden in October 1940 when I was almost 2. And it blew up my dad's garden, which was a shame because he was a very, very keen gardener. And it blew all the windows out. We had the ARP people round, and I used to have cod liver oil and malt, like a lot of children did at that time. And the fireman managed to knock my huge jar of malt out of the cupboard onto the kitchen hard tiled floor and smash it. So they walked cod liver oil and malt all round the house.
Your mum must have been thrilled about that.
Yes, I think she was. My dad was on night duty. He worked for Western Union in the city. So my mum never quite knew if he was going to get back after the Blitz. And he was away, and when he got back he saw what was left of his garden, which was a vast crater. It had blown chunks of clay and chalk sky high. It was only a small bomb, I think, which was just as well, but it was big enough to blow his garden to smithereens.
Now, you told me earlier that the Anderson shelter you'd been supplied with never got erected in the garden, and maybe that turned out to be a good thing.
That's correct, yes. My dad loved his garden. It was his great hobby, and he in the garden that we had then, he had landscaped it, so the beautiful tree, crabapple, weeping birch, silver birch, and it was not a big garden, but it was quite long. And so he'd done it in such a way that you had all different vistas. It was very cleverly done. And there's no way he would have desecrated his garden by putting up an Anderson shelter in it, let alone having to dig the hole to put the corrugated iron over to keep us all safe. And so he'd somehow come by half an Anderson shelter and stuck it up in the corner of the room, which I don't think would actually have helped us very much. And when I later researched it, I discovered that the bomb had actually landed in the only place that he could have put an Anderson shelter, which would have done for the lot of us. Yes. So I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. But
what's the phrase? There but for the grace of God.
Yes.
Now tell me about your dad's war work, because he had an interesting war.
Yes. He was a cable telegraphist for Western Union, who had a premises in the city. And he did quite a lot of night work and day work. He did shifts which affected his sleep for the rest of his life. And he was very good at what he did. He was a very intelligent man, but he'd been brought up, I think, sort of during hard times, and he was always terrified of losing work. So he stuck at being a cable telegraphist when he could have done lots of other things. And towards the end of the war, he was seconded to the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, where he worked in a locked room, and he was the man who sent messages between Churchill and Eisenhower or whatever across the Atlantic. So yes, he also he was a very, very keen, quite a leading amateur archaeologist. He liked pursuits, lonely pursuits, if you like. He liked being on his own. And he's also very careful with money. So he used to bribe some of the men trying to rebuild the London after the Blitz. He used to bribe them, and they bring him things that they'd found, because the Nazi Blitz had exposed a lot of Roman London, which was his great thing. And he got little oil lamps, he got pieces of jewellery, And his prized possession, which we had in our garage for years, was a huge Roman roof tile off a villa. It was about this size, very heavy. And when it had been drying, a cat had been chased by a dog across it, and you could see the paw marks in it. And he had an exhibition or two at the Guildhall Museum. He had an amazing selection of stuff. So, yes, it worked for him, and he survived too.
Whatever happened to all his artefacts?
I think, as I recall, we donated a lot of them to the Guildhall Museum. That's all I can remember.
Now, something else, another memory for you, the doodle bug.
Oh, yes. Yes, well, obviously I was between 0 and 7 while the war was on. And yes, I remember the doodle bugs very clearly. This horrible noise they made, and then suddenly the engine would stop and you'd know that somebody was for it, and then it would go.
And that's the moment of terror, is it?
Yes, absolute terror. Yes, the terrible things. And of course they did have V2s after that. One of them landed near us one day, and they were like the modern guided missile. You didn't know that they were there until the whole street would be destroyed. Yes, I spent a lot of my childhood in, well, playing war. My brother and I, he was 6 years older than me, we had special passwords to get into each other's rooms, and they were all to do with the war. I think one of them was Alamein, and it could have been Trafalgar, but yes, it was all war. And my brother was shipped out. He was quite a difficult child. He was shipped out to school in Sussex, and I went down to see him from London. They kept me in London. And I can remember very clearly playing in burned out Nazi bombers, and of course they'd sent him to the very place where of course all the dogfights were taking place, about the most dangerous place in England. And his school, which was an old, I think it was a Victorian building but with mock Tudor chimneys, he reckoned that V1s were flying so low that they'd actually pass between the chimneys of his school, which was on a bit of a hill. But yes, that was where he went.
So as a war baby, Michael, growing up in the war, I mean, were kids slightly one step removed from it, and they could use it to play war and have fun?
Yes,
was that the
absolutely,
feeling?
Absolutely. Yes, I can recall in Woodside Park, where I was brought up in North London, which was on the edge of the countryside, but there were some houses there, and I remember walking past them where the whole of the side of the house had been blown out, and you could see the wallpaper still flapping and the chair still next to the fireplace and nobody there. And yes, we played a lot in bombed out buildings, and in air raid shelters, of course.
Now, your mum was a librarian, you told me.
Yes.
So that meant that she was an educated woman herself. Was she able to give you a good schooling before you went to school?
Yes, I think so. I was very loved, and I don't remember the schooling part. I remember laughing and having fun. One of the bits of fun I had relates to the bomb. It had blown a huge chunk of chalk up out from deep into the ground into the corner of the garden, and it made a natural little fort. So I would go and stand behind it, had a few holes in it, and hurl stones and bits of rock at my friends outside. We used it as a fort.
The chalk fort.
Yeah, chalk fort, yeah. I went to a very good local school which was beautifully planned and built, called Frith Manor, where we used every Empire Day, which doesn't exist now of course, we would sing the songs of Empire. We'd sing Sari Murray for South Africa. It was only about a mile from my home, and it was a beautifully designed school. I did very well, and I got a scholarship to a public school, Haberdashers' Asks, which was in Cricklewood at the time, where I found myself a bit out of my depth with a lot of rather bright people. I don't know if you remember Leon Britton, who's our youngest ever, I think, Chancellor.
Yeah.
He was in my class, and he, even in the first year, the teachers were despairing of being able to teach him anything because he'd seemed to know it already. Yes, it's very academic. We had a very good sports record, and I didn't excel at anything academic, but I wasn't too bad at sport. I enjoyed cricket particularly there.
That's where your love of cricket began?
It began there, yes. I spent a large part of my childhood thinking what an incredibly boring game cricket is, and suddenly I got the bug and I've never lost it. It seems a wonderful, well, it's such a wonderful game, where man and God, if you like, come together like a village cricket green. Is just so wonderful, seeing those white-clad players and the willow and the church tower and the trees. I just love all that. And I also love Lord's. I never miss a year. I go to Lord's. It's a pilgrimage for me, like it is to Mecca for some. I go to Lord's every year. Yes, I've been involved with cricket at not a very high level, but that doesn't matter because somehow cricket is all inclusive. It's a wonderful team game, but it's a wonderful individual game too.
What was your particular skill?
Well, I started off as a bowler, and then I ended up as a very dour opening batsman. Nobody could get me out. I couldn't score many runs, but luckily I used to spend a large part of my cricketing career when I played for the old haberdashers with a dear late friend who was a very spectacular batsman. So he scored all the runs, and I just stayed there and made the bowlers sweat. That was what I did, and then later on I became not a bad leg spin bowler. I took a few wickets in my dotage, and a very slow and quite adept slip fielder, because once I got down it was rather difficult to get up, so I could take low catches quite well. But yes, cricket has been a large part of my life.
Village cricket involves the young and the old. Was that important to you, the mix of ages?
Yes, it was somehow. Yes, when I was young, I used to watch these old boys of 50, 60 coming up and sending up donkey drops, and even I was tempted to have a go at some of them, but they took a lot of wickets. It was interesting to see how the wisdom of old age overcame the enthusiasm of youth. I actually once watched a match between the England ladies 11 and Brighton College boys, and it was shown there it's not all about strength. The girls, they were such brilliant fielders, and their bowling, it wasn't particularly fast, but it was very good.
It was accurate on the spot.
Yes, and the boys wanted to show the girls a thing or two, and they failed miserably.
Yes. Now, were you able to carry all this knowledge and love over when you started coaching youngsters?
Yes, well, when I was about 19, I think it was, I went to a local church, and the vicar was a sports master at Mill Hill School, which was near me, and I used to go up there and help him coach the youngsters, and I enjoyed it, so that later on I did a little bit of coaching. I'm not a qualified coach, but I wanted to stay involved and give something back, and I became a scorer. I couldn't stand up for very long, so I couldn't become an umpire, although I trained, but I became a scorer, and I scored for some of the Sussex County junior sides. I have a picture of one somewhere, shall I get it?
So you scored for some of the county sides?
Yes. The county juniors, and we had a lovely fixture most years. For about 3 years I went there at King's Taunton School, which has some wonderful playing fields and is a lovely building, and we would sit in this great school hall with old school headmasters looking down at us, refectory tables, and they were lovely boys. These were boys of between 10 and 15, say, and some of them I still keep up with them with their parents, And it was a lovely time. The way the parents would support their sons to take them to cricket miles away. And some of them would since come on to play for Sussex and universities and probably other counties. And yes, it's surprising. I still follow cricket regularly in the summer, normally, at Hastings, which has a very good side. And of course we play all the major sides in Sussex, so I see some of these boys as they get older and their parents, which is great. I really enjoy that.
What do you think of Jofra Archer?
Oh, fantastic. I love Jofra Archer. Yeah, our secret weapon. And he can bat a bit too.
He's proved that, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Let me take you back to haberdashers. When you finished school, I suppose on the map for you looming is national service, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I did. I just did a year in a merchant bank in the city at number 3 Lombard Street, which was great. And then I did national service, which was in the Royal Artillery. Trained up at Oswestry in February, I think it was, 58. And got very cold and was sort of inspired by the army. I really loved the life. And then we were sent out to Germany, where we inhabited a lovely ex-Luftwaffe camp, which had so many facilities, unlike all the English camps. They were so much better looked after. They had a huge running track in the middle, a football field, and our regiment was planning to go to Malaya, and so I became one of the very first meteorologists in the British Army, because in the Second World War the British 25-pounders, which were the guns we used being a field regiment, were very inaccurate because of the atmospherics, and so the meteorology side of it was very important to us. And we were mostly people, we'd gone for a commission but we failed it. We all had a bit of an education, but for one reason or another we weren't officers. So we inhabited what they called we were in the headquarters block in a sort of penthouse of our own, and there were lots of rather stupid sergeant majors and non-commissioned officers who thought we were officers, and they kept saluting us, so we saluted back. And we had a great time. We went out onto Lüneburg Heath, where the Germans surrendered, I think, at the end of the war, and sent up balloons and looked at them through theodolites and then shot them down with our First World War rifles. And somehow learned something about meteorology, but I can't remember what it was. And the thing was, there was no discipline, unlike in basic training, for example, where you had these terrible boneheaded men shouting at you all the time. And we were taught by civilians. So it's like being back at school again. I mean, we got up to all sorts of silly tricks.
What was the attitude to the German people, to the British Army of the Rhine, I suppose it was
It depended where you were. I was in Hildesheim, which is not far from Hanover, and they were basically unfriendly. In fact, the night I arrived there, we were given a lecture by the regimental sergeant major, who told us how to protect ourselves if we got attacked in the street. And the classic one was the belt. You took your belt off, and they were khaki webbing belts with brass bits. And so I thought, I'm not sure I want to be here. But there were fights. And yes, in Hildesheim we were not popular, but when we went on summer camps sometimes, just a few of us, we'd go to the Harz Mountains, which wasn't too far away. We'd borrow the battery truck and we'd do sort of things like, well, we'd camp and we would have barbecues and wide games and do all sorts of things that fit young men do. And there it's totally different, because we were so much closer to the East German border. We were welcomed with open arms. And we would we'd sell them our English cigarettes, and they would give us fruit or something like that.
Mm. So maybe the British Army was the lesser of two evils in that respect, you think, because the Soviets were just up the road?
Yes, exactly, yes. In fact, I can well remember walking through the Harz Mountains with a couple of friends, and we were on two different sides of a fence, and we didn't think what fence it was. And I was on the West German side, and we suddenly realised when we saw a machine gun post that our friend was in East Germany.
So they didn't open fire on him?
No, we crept away very quietly and he found his way through again. But yeah, they were very friendly in that area, and we had some very, very good times. We had a sergeant major who had been decorated in the Second World War for doing something suicidal, like jumping up on a Panzer tank and dropping a grenade through the turret or something like that. And he was completely balmy, and he'd take us to bars in that area, which was really rather respectable, in Harman Clay. It was like a little model village, and he would eat the flowers in the bowl on the table, and he'd drink vast amounts and teach us how to.
So those are the soldiering days, but work must have loomed on the horizon. You had to give that up, obviously National Service 2 years, come back to London, find a job. So what was your chosen path?
Well, I didn't know what to do when I left school, but my father had a brother who was a great grand viveur, I think they call it, and who persuaded me to go into the wine trade via a friend of his who was a port producer. And somehow I ended up going to the wine trade. I liked to have a drink, and so I went into the wine business, and I started work at a wonderful shop called Hedges and Butler in Regent Street, which had been founded in 1667, and they'd held the royal warrant throughout that period. It was run by two men, both of whom had been officers. One was a Gurkha officer and one was a guards officer, so it was very military lines that it was run on. And I loved it. I liked the discipline of the army, and I liked knowing where I am. And we had a photo of the Queen. It was the first thing you saw when you came into our shop, or front office as we used to call it. And we'd sit on stools like Dickensian characters behind a mahogany counter, and people would come in, and they supplied many a famous name, and also many genuine connoisseurs, so I learned a huge amount from the customers there. Then I was taken on to run the vans. We had a van delivery service, 2-ton Bedfords, the sort that we used in the war, to deliver to the home counties, and everyone seemed to live in posh bits of Surrey and the Thames Valley and Norfolk and so on. And I used to run the 3 drivers, who were great, and then subsequently they sent me out as a salesman to sell to restaurants and clubs and hotels, which was a very lonely life, but I enjoyed it. I didn't have a company car, but there was usually a car available of some kind to use.
Can you remember what it was?
Yes, it was a standard.
A standard 8, possibly?
No, it was the one up from the 8. I can't remember what it was called, but yes, it was fairly small, but it was fairly new. John Hill, who'd been the Gurkha man, it was his car, and it still had. They used to sell cars with polythene covering on the seats to protect the upholstery. And I can recall taking my mother out to lunch in St Albans up at about that time, and I don't know if you know St Albans High Street, but it's quite wide, and she had to get a bus back to Woodside Park, and I saw it coming the other way, so I did a U-turn. Oh no, it's a Triumph Herald, I'm sorry, it's a Triumph Herald. And she hadn't fastened her door properly, so I did the U-turn, her door flew open, and she shot all along this polythene seat into the gutter, right next to this crowd of shocked onlookers who were queuing for the bus. And she got up and brushed herself down, said, "See you at tea time, Michael," and got on the bus.
Those are the days. Now, what about Northampton? You ended up in Northampton.
Yes, I went there after Hedges and Butler as an assistant cellar manager it's a converted grain warehouse on the Grand Union Canal, a place called Blisworth, and it was pretty modern for its day in that we had our bottling was all done on the top floor, and our storage, we used to have containers of wine delivered on the ground floor, and so the wine was pumped from the containers into the vats in the basement and then under high pressure sent up to the very top floor, which wouldn't have done him much good. But and there we bottled it, and then from there we had a series of conveyor belts which would take it to different parts of the warehouse. It's pretty up to date. And I had a boss there who was a costs and works accountant who suffered from depression, which I have since, so I don't belittle depression, but he used to spend days at a time smoking embassy cigarettes and looking out the window while he left me to it, which was fine. And we had part of our warehouse was bonded, so I bonded with the customs officers, and we used to go up to the local pub and play skittles with those cheeses. I don't know if you know that form, but you'd hurl a cheese which looked just like a cheese, about that size, wood, onto a table which looked like a Victorian armchair with skittles on it, and we became quite adept at that. And from there I took on probably my best job, which was cellar manager at the Wine Society. That's the original wine club.
That must have been a feather in your cap.
It was, yes. I was really pleased to get it. I had a wonderful boss there who was a master of wine and taught me almost everything I learned about wine. He was brilliant. And he'd take me up to the tasting room from time to time and say, Michael, we must show you how important standards are. So we tasted some very, very fine wines. And one day we went to the tasting room and he showed me several first growths like Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton Rothschild, and I made avid tasting notes. Yes, he was a remarkable boss, because the Wine Society attracted a certain sort of person, people who loved wine, and he loved wine. It wasn't just a commercial operation, and it still isn't, because it's registered as a friendly society, so that all the money is put back into stock rather than profits for the directors. So it's run by a committee, and I was one of the professional staff. We moved, when I joined, we moved the old cellars, which were the old fungoid sort of spider-webbed candlelit cellars under the Thames and under the London Palladium and under London Bridge. They all had to be stripped of their contents, and the bottles were all repacked into cardboard boxes for the new above-ground temperature-conditioned warehouse in Stevenage. And we moved it, the whole lot, one weekend. Every 20 minutes a flatbedded truck would arrive, and we ran on forklift trucks. So it was quite a challenge, and I worked very, very hard at that place, but it was wonderful. I sound like an advert for the Wine Society, but then I am.
But you still use the Wine Society?
I do,
yourself?
yes, occasionally. At Christmas I get something from them. Yes.
Do you get a discount because you were once the cellar manager?
No, they're not interested. No, whenever I phone with an order, whenever I speak to the person on the switchboard, I used to be cellar manager with you. I said, oh yeah, what would you like?
Time moves on, doesn't it? Now, when you became, when wine was brought in, your palate and your nose did become quite important, didn't it, with the wines coming?
Yes, we had a buyer who obviously selected the wines beforehand, but my responsibility was to make sure when casks arrived, it was all in wood at that time, that the wines were in good condition. For example, we had very big vats holding gallons and gallons, so that you might get 20 casks of one wine or 50. You had to make sure every cask was okay. I knew how to tell whether a wine was all right or not. You did get ones where you had a bad cask which hadn't been cleaned properly, which smelt wrong, and that was mainly the thing. So you made sure that one didn't get pumped into the vat with the rest. And yes, it was quite hard on the taste buds, because tasting 50 hogsheads of new claret is not an easy job, because it's full of tannin, and the Wine Society, we bought wines for laying down because of the nature of the business, so that it wasn't like tasting a mature wine. It was full of tannin and very difficult to tell one from another, so you relied an awful lot on your nose.
Mm. Did you acquire a taste for the product? What was your favourite?
Yes, I did. Well, I still love Chilean wines. I mean, my favourite is good claret. I love Bordeaux. That's the wine I know the best, I think. And the Wine Society were brilliant on claret, which is always sold too young these days. Good claret needs bottle age, that's for sure. But Chilean, when I first had a glass of Chilean, which were in the cellars of Hedges and Butler, which I mentioned earlier, I could tell there was something special about it, and it had this life and cleanness about it. And I subsequently learned the story of phylloxera, which was a dreadful scourge in the vineyards of Europe in the late 19th century, where it closed down. It's a vine disease which closed down all the great chateaux of Bordeaux and all across Europe and other parts of the world. And it turned out, after they tried to solve it by flooding the vineyards and burning them and using chemicals, they discovered that it had come to Europe from some vine cuttings from the USA, which were due for cure, and it had somehow spread. But fortunately, a great wine expert from Chile had visited Europe just a few months before, and had taken back with him to Chile some of the classic vine varieties like Malbec and Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. And so most Chilean vineyards are now based upon pure European stock, unlike just about anywhere else in the world. And that was what I picked up with my naive palate all those years ago.
Mm. And it stayed with you, of course. You can still do it.
Yes, yes. I love Chilean wine, and I actually, when I had a wine bar in London later on, I became the biggest stockist of Chilean wine in London. I could almost say I started the Chilean wine craze in this country.
Now, you don't look like a natural publican. Did you take to that side of things easily?
No, I didn't. I'm not a natural publican. I don't think I like people enough. I found lunchtimes were brilliant because I was situated just off Marylebone Road, where there are lots of big head offices, as you'll know. And I was packed out at lunchtime. And there were lots of men of a certain age who appreciated decent wine and liked a posh sandwich. I used to do posh sandwiches. But in the evenings, it's not an area where people congregate and go out, so that was quite hard. But I did attempt to turn it into what I call a French cafe sort of atmosphere. And in the end, I did get very diverse people coming in of an evening. And I used to get specialists from Harley Street. And one of my greatest evenings was when there were two specialists. One was Elizabeth Taylor's personal physician, was sitting there with the top X-ray man in Harley Street. They were good friends, and they always came in for champagne. While they were sitting there, a bunch of motorcycle lads in their leathers came in, their helmets, and oh crikey. But I introduced them somehow, and we had a wonderful, wonderful evening. And the first thing that one of them said, which endeared him to me, was, "Oh, we've heard this is a good wine, but we've been going down to Crawford's, which was my big competitor, and the wine's not up to much." So they really liked my wine, they appreciated it.
So these motorcycle boys
Yeah.
like to drop a fine wine.
Yeah, they
That's
did.
extraordinary, isn't it? Let me take you back one stage out to Norfolk and Norwich, because I'm very interested in the Harold Wilson story. Now, tell me about that.
Well, I worked for a company called Coleman's, Colemans at Norwich, who subsequently got taken over by Coleman's, the mustard people. Coleman's, their big money spinner was Wincarnis, tonic wine, so-called, which I believe was the tipple of choice for Harold Wilson. And I produced it. I produced it, I sort of oversaw the producing of it. I was called the progress manager, and they had a team of very good executives, but they were all at each other's throats all the time, so I was brought in to sort of bring it all together. And one of the things I did was blend Wincarnis, which consisted of huge quantities of very cheap Cypriot wine, I think it was, brought in road like oil tankers, pumped into a vat, and then we would get things like vast oxo cubes. You put all this red hot steam through the cube and you'd end up with this disgusting smell. And then you pour a sort of packet or two of vitamins into it, stir it up, put it in the vat, press a button and a propeller sort of mixed it all up. And then after a few weeks of settling, then you bottle it off the lees.
So was each batch slightly different, or was there a strict
well, that's a good
menu?
question. Well, the menu was strict, but I suspect it wasn't always exactly the same. We did two types. One was for this market, and the other, which was slightly better, I think, was for the West African and West Indian market, where it was marketed as an aphrodisiac. Our advertising department did a really naff advert with a woman, a big coal-black mammy, going to see the doctor and saying, "My man isn't doing his work proper, I want some kids." And he says, "I recommend Wincarnis," and then the next picture is she's there with about 6 kids, and then I'm looking exhausted next to her and said, "That Wincarnis doing half work." And so yes, that was the staple of the company, but we did very well with it in this country compared to any of the other wines we sold. So when our salesman went out with a price list, the page on which Wincarnis stood was perforated, so if you were going to see a fine wine merchant, you tore the Wincarnis page out. You couldn't mix the two.
Good Lord, that's a story. Can you remember where you met your first wife?
Yes, I met my first wife on holiday. I'm pretty sure it was in Llandudno. My mother was religious and liked church. My dad didn't, but she usually got her way, and we used to have quite inexpensive holidays, which appealed to my dad, at places called Christian Endeavour homes, which were great for kids because they were very sociable. There was no smoking or drinking, but that didn't bother me in those days. And we would go out on trips. We would have little sing-songs. We'd have concerts. There'd always be a tennis court or table tennis table. So I met a lot of other young kids, and they were brilliant. And yes, I met Anne. Our parents took up on holiday. Her father had a very big car, and my dad didn't have one at the time, so my mother was very good talking to men with big cars. Yes, it went from there really, and then she lived in the West Riding of Yorkshire.
And where were you living at this stage?
Still
in London?
Yes, in London at home. Yeah.
I mean, that's a hell of a distance to have the start of a love affair over that distance in those days.
Yes. Well, I was a virgin, and it was my first experience, really. I mean, I'd had the odd girlfriend, but I didn't know what to do. Well, I had a vague idea, but Yes, and she used to come down to London.
On the train? Is that?
Yes, on the train.
Was
yeah,
the commute?
King's Cross, and I'd go up. And later on, my dad bought a Mini, and I'd drive up there. And no, she was a lovely woman, very beautiful.
Was the M1 built then? Was the M1?
It was just being built, as I recall, because I remember her dad was a great cinematographer, and he used to go out and take pictures of them working on the M1. Yes, I think we used to have to use the A1, as I recall.
Yes. Oh, it's still there. I can guarantee you it's still there. It's still there. Now, you had children?
Yes, we had 3 children. 1 boy, 2 girls. Adrian, Sean and Tara, who I'm still very much in touch with. They really kept Anne and I together for longer than we might otherwise have stayed together. We rather we moved apart.
So you loved the children, but not necessarily each other.
That was the way it was. Yes. And yes, I still do, and I still see Anne occasionally, perfectly amicable, but the marriage folded. And
did you marry again?
yes, I did. In 79. I get mixed up with the years. Yes, I did. I married Jeanette, who was a brilliant executive wife, and I'd become an executive by that time. And she had a way with men, including me, and we did some wonderful work. I shortly after I met her, she encouraged me to join a champagne company called Lanson Black Label Champagne, and I became the Northern Sales Manager. And we sponsored the Birmingham Horse Show and all sorts of races, and I was on racetracks presenting bottles to owners. And in fact, we were invited a couple of years to an event in Cumbria called the something or other horse trials. It's the one where, you know, the Duke of Edinburgh does carriage driving, or did. And that was a very prestigious event, and Prince Philip was there, and we had to entertain various nobs in our Lanson caravan, and we had the Yellow Earl, what's his name, the boxing man, Lonsdale, who was about 70, with his young blonde wife who looked like she'd just come off EastEnders. Sorry, I'm being really snobbish there. And we entertained Lord Inglewood, at whose house it was. And I had to, it's a long story, but to shorten it considerably, I had to present Prince Philip with a magnum of Lanson champagne because he won it. And it's a wonderful summer's day out, and I remember I was wearing my very best suit, some German thing I bought, which was very smart, I thought. And I presented him with this magnum of champagne, and he was so thrilled at winning. He was like a boy, and he said, "Oh, can I drink it now?" But he was really thrilled with that win. I've always liked the Duke of Edinburgh. So yes, and we did quite a lot of entertaining, and we sat down. Princess Anne flew in a helicopter at some point in the day, and so Jeanette and I had to sit down with this amazing company of people in this amazing house and be served dinner, where the Yellow Earl, Lord Lonsdale, unfortunately was sitting next to Jeanette and started fumbling with her under the table.
What a story. Was this where your own champagne label came about?
No, my own champagne label, that came about when I was running this little wine bar. And an old friend from the trade who represented a French company called Marne et Champagne came in and said, "Oh, we could do an own label for you." I didn't even go to Champagne for this, but I knew Champagne by then. And it was very good. I was surprisingly good. A lot of own label champagnes are not. But this was lovely and dry, and it was perfect for me. So I bought, I think, 25 cases, which was a lot, but I was amazed how well it did, because I kept some proprietary champagne at that time in the bar, because I sold in the bar and for off sales. And the one I kept, I can't remember, it's quite well known one. And as soon as I introduced this, everybody wanted it. And the sales of the other one disappeared, and I sold masses of this. Well, for me it was masses. So 25 cases went up to 50 cases at a time, and yeah, people bought it by the case.
Good Lord.
It did really
Do you
well.
think anyone's still got a bottle of Michael Gould champagne in their cellar?
I hope they've drunk it.
Now, I wanted to ask you about your love of Wolverhampton Wanderers. I mean, I can see your fine shirt you've got on. Where did that come from then? Where did your love of Wolves come from?
Well, the shirt came from my son, who's also become a Wolves supporter, Adrian. When I was in my teens, Wolverhampton Wanderers were the sort of Manchester United of today. They were winning everything in sight, and I believe I'm right in saying they were the first football team in Europe from this country. And I can remember sitting watching black and white television of them playing Moscow Spartak, for example, and there's another team, several in Russia. And they were wonderful. Their captain was a man called Billy Wright, whose statue is now at Molineux in Wolverhampton. Their goalkeeper was Bert Williams, who was the England goalkeeper, and they had wonderful players all round. I could name most of them if I put my mind to it. And I became enamoured of them. All my friends were supporting Tottenham Hotspur and Arsenal. So I sent off and I got a wonderful packet of stuff, and I stuck their pictures all over my wall at home. And I've followed them ever since. And since then, they've been from the first division, as it then was, down to the fourth division, and then they've come up, and now they're in the Premiership, as you know. And it's just a wonderful resurrection for Wolves, and I'm making the most of it.
Didn't Billy Wright marry a Beverley sister?
Yes, that's right, yeah, Joy.
And they were almost like Posh and Becks, weren't they, with the pop star and the footballer?
I think,
wasn't that?
Yes, very much so. Yes, that's right. Yeah, Joy Beverley. Yeah.
Now, we've had cricket, we've had football, but there's a spiritual side to your life also, isn't there, which has run alongside your sporting stuff. Tell me about that.
Well, depression seems to run in my family, clinical depression, and I suffered from it for quite some years, which was partly what did for my first marriage, I think. It must be very difficult to live with it. And when I was about 50, I think it was, I'd been on pills for many years, and they just kept it at bay, but I knew how easy it was to slip really down into something quite deep and suicidal, I suppose. And I was desperate, and I was running a wine merchant in Battersea at the time. I'd been taken back into the trade by a very old friend, and I was running the top ranked wine merchants. And I started to feel this sort of coming up on me, so I thought, I've got to do something. So I discovered somebody who was called a rebirther. And I was very lucky, because the lady in question, her name was Liz Cornish, was my saviour, in that she was secretary of the British Rebirth Association. Rebirthing is a therapy based upon the power of the breath. And I went to her for a few weeks, and something extraordinary happened. One night after 8 sessions, I found myself unable to sleep, which is very unlike me, especially these days. And I had to get up, and I was living just off Clapham Common at the time. I walked around the common and I started weeping. And I wept for hours, and I remember particularly I went onto the bandstand, and I was sitting on the bandstand on Clapham Common at 3 o'clock in the morning weeping my heart out. People have since told me that Clapham Common isn't a very good place to walk around at night. But anyway, and something happened, and I knew something extraordinary had happened, and I threw all my pills away, which was a very brave and foolhardy thing to do, but I did, and I felt incredibly happy for weeks afterwards. And I went and saw my doctor at the hospital, and I said, "Have you heard of rebirthing, young man?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you should have done." Anyway, rebirthing introduced me to a book called A Course in Miracles, which a lot of it is sort of based on. I associate the two in my mind. I subsequently trained as a rebirther, and I've rebirthed many people. And I believe in it. The power of the breath is just stunning. But the Course in Miracles, I was brought up in quite a religious family, and I'd been to church, and I'd been a Sunday school teacher, and in the end I discovered that Christianity as such didn't work for me. Although I always loved Jesus. And A Course in Miracles is a channeled book. It's got an amazing story attached to it, but basically it's a message from Jesus, I'm in no doubt of that, which somehow came through the ether. Don't ask me how, but it's all written down by a Jewish atheist who was a doctor in a hospital in New York. And she kept getting these messages, and they came through in the middle of meetings at inconvenient times, but then if she was in the middle of something, it would come back later. And so she started to write it down. She thought she was going balmy. And then luckily her boss was a thinking man, and he said, "Oh, well, write it down, let's see what it is." And to cut a long story short, it was published. Nobody thought she was going mad, and it somehow grew of its own volition almost, and it became quite big in America, and then it's translated into about 30-40 languages now. And it's been my anchor, if you like, for the rest of my life. It's an amazing book. I've been at it now for 30 years. I sort of know almost every word. It's totally, it is about a reality which is not of this world. And I'd always wondered, I'd always thought, well, this world is rather weird. Everyone's starving and everyone's killing everyone, and it doesn't work. And nothing's changed in the world. It doesn't. And I discovered something else, which I suppose I call love, or God, or something. And it's at the basis of everything I do now. I hold a little group here of people who are studying it. It really challenges one's ego totally. And I still get challenged occasionally. I used to find it incredibly difficult at the beginning, but now I accept that this world isn't actually real. It is some sort of dream, and that there's something very much better. Well, what's the word? Incomparable, that is real, and I believe it totally. So I try to transmit that in everything I say and do.
Good. Now, let me just change tack for a second, because there's another corner of your varied life which we haven't touched on, and that's amateur dramatics. Now, where did this interest in the stage come from?
My mother was a very keen Amdram person. I remember she took the part of Queen Elizabeth in Gloriana at the local Townsend's Guild. She was very dramatic. So I guess it comes from there. But yes, I used to love doing Amdram. And yes, my greatest days were in a place called Seaford, where I was a member of a company at the Barn Theatre. I met some brilliant actors and actresses and singers, and in fact the best thing I think I have ever been in was My Fair Lady.
Oh, I was in that.
Oh, yes, sir,
yes,
you were.
I was Higgins in that. Yes, I had a minor part.
Brilliant. That was a wonderful production. In fact, I remember looking at the time at the film that starred
Rex
Harrison and
Audrey Hepburn.
Audrey Hepburn, that's it. And I thought our production was much better than the film. I really did. I thought the lady doing, what's her name, you know, the star.
Eliza,
I bumped into her recently.
I came to that quite late, so you didn't do anything as a younger man. You just did it as a
Yeah, I did do a bit.
thing?
Yeah, I used to appear in the. I used to do rowing at school, and I appeared in the boat club review. I love the Eton boating song. It's one of my favourite songs. I think I'd done a little bit of what I can't remember now, but I'd done a little. Oh, I used to do quite a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan, which was what brought me to Seaford.
Yes.
Yes, I did some Gilbert and Sullivan in London, which I'm very fond of. But you don't often see GNS produce these days, do you?
It just doesn't bring in the money. That's what's changed. It's all about making money now.
Yeah, yeah.
It used to be, because I did it for 25 years, as a hobby.
Yeah.
Now they're so desperate to make money because that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Make money for the society, put on the next show.
Yeah.
And that's what's changed with it,
Sense.
I think.
Yeah.
Have you got any major regrets in life? Is there something that you wished you'd done, Michael, that you never did?
Yes, I wished I'd done skiing, and I wish I'd done gliding. I love that sort of, I don't know, the elements and skiing. Yeah, I do regret that a little. I mean, when I was growing up, of course, it was rather a posh pursuit. It cost a lot of money, and gliding, I just don't know. I never got around to it, but I like the idea of being up there and hearing the wind in the.
But you're not one of these that's suddenly going to take up gliding in your dotage and go.
I don't think so.
No.
No, I can sort of imagine it if I want to, and I'm sure there's a television programme on it. But I like watching Ski Sunday. I love to watch skiing. Obviously it's dangerous, but the beauty of it and the skill and the strength, they really are inspiring, I think.
Anything you would have done differently if you had your chance over?
I would have gone into writing in some form, because that's the one real skill I have. I do write very well. Maybe journalism, but I don't know. I've enjoyed what I've done. No, I don't hanker after anything else, really. Yeah.
So it's been a relatively happy and content life. You're now a contented man.
Oh, very much so. Yes.
You're on the level. You don't.
Yes.
Have mood swings and.
No, I don't. Well, I have certain mood swings, but then we all do. No, the last 30 years have been great, and I love retirement. I absolutely love retirement. That thought of not having to do anything,
yes.
It makes me very lazy.
And you get out, of course, on your little mobility scooter.
Yes, my scooter. Yeah, that's been a lifeline. It's wonderful. I recommend you all to a mobility scooter.
Didn't somebody steal your helmet? Didn't you lose a helmet?
Yes, I did. Yes, we have a little garage here where we recharge the batteries. It's quite secure, and in fact I've left. Whenever I leave my helmet, I find Hastings a very good place to leave things. I've never had anything stolen. It seems basic. I mean, it has its darker side, but I feel very safe in Hastings leaving things around, and people generally seem very honest. And I left it in a locked up garage, and my helmet, which I left on the seat, disappeared, and I put up angry notices saying if this is not returned. I thought it was a joke, I shall call the police, but I never did, and I never had it returned. So.
What's your message, Michael, for the younger generation, the people of today, the people that are coming up, that maybe older people look down on and think, oh my God, if we were in the Second World War again, these people wouldn't step up and fight for us, because it all seems to be about self now, doesn't it? There doesn't seem to be any general thing. Do you have a message for...
One message I'd like to give the young people is, whatever you do, go to New Zealand. I love New Zealand. I have my sister wife is there, but it's a wonderful country, and they are dealing with COVID brilliantly. Having said that, what would I say to young people?
Well, if I could get a date with Jacinta Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, I'd go, because she's one of the most attractive women I've ever seen.
Amazing. Yes.
Do you think that the younger generation can still learn stuff from the older generation? Do you think we still have a role to play?
I think so. I think what the younger generation can learn from the older is that this is a great country. It may not seem perfect, but it is great, and that's not all about war and empire. I'm talking about toleration and being loving. I think the younger generation face, in some ways, a troubled future with global warming and all that's going on the planet. But yes, look after the planet and be happy.
Who are your favourite performers that you used to watch, maybe in television or in the movies or on stage?
Television was a very big institution in our house. Eamon Andrews springs immediately to mind, and What's My Line? We used to watch that regularly. Hancock's Half
Half.
Hancock's Half Hour.
Yes, Hancock's Half Hour. When it came to movies, well, I remember people like Maureen O'Hara, Bob Hope, Stuart Granger, Gregory Peck. They were all great people, I thought.
Did your mum and dad take you to the theatre, to the music hall? Was that something you did?
Not the music hall, that was before my time. My dad's family loved music hall. My mother took me to the pictures quite a bit, the Gaumont North Finchley, which smelled of Three Hands disinfectant and had all these slightly dated pictures of stars on the walls. The first one I remember seeing was one called The Black Narcissus, starring Stuart Granger, which is some
I remember that. Yeah.
I think it's some sort of sad love story. Oh, and Saraband for Dead Lovers was another one. Yes, it's my mum that took me to the cinema. I used to go to Saturday morning pictures and watch people like all the great cowboy characters. I can't remember them all.
Where Tom Mix, I imagine, was in there.
Yes, Tom Mix, Hi-O Silver, whatever his name.
Hopalong Cassidy.
Yes, Hopalong Cassidy, yes, all those ones. I used to enjoy that and used to sit there with sort of smoke filling the upper areas illuminated by the projector. I don't know who was smoking, it wasn't me. But yes, Saturday morning pictures. We've got Laurel and Hardy. I love Laurel and Hardy still. I think they're the best, I think.
They came to Kent, you know, they came around these parts. If you go on the Tenterton Railway, you'll see cutouts of them because they came to the Tenterton Railway and performed on the platform, and they were promoting some. It was their last tour in London. Wow. And there's all this fabulous footage of them actually doing their jokes and pushing each other in.
Oh, how brilliant.
I have to drive past it and see their waxworks that they've got on the platform. I think, why are Laurel and Hardy, what have they got to do with this? But they were actually
what they had to do.
linked to here. Now, you've ended up in Hastings. Is this it for till the end, Michael? You don't think you go anywhere else?
I don't think so. No, I like Hastings. I always had an idea that I'd like to live in the Thames Valley. I like posh places, really. But Hastings is just so... It's a lovely mix of things, and it's so cool and relaxed. I love that, and a mixture of races and a mixture of types. I love it here. I've never lived anywhere that is so cosmopolitan, I think, and happy with it.
Yeah.